What if I told you the deadliest room in any medieval castle wasn't the dungeon, the battlefield, or the siege lines, but the kitchen? That's right. More people died there than from enemy swords or torture racks combined. And the cruelest part? It was also the only warm, cosy place in the entire freezing stone fortress. In a world of ice-cold walls and howling drafts, the kitchen was the one room that offered life-giving heat and hot food, while slowly destroying everyone who stepped inside it. It was medieval Florida, warm, humid, and terrifyingly flammable. For centuries, lords demanded their kitchens stay close for convenience, until devastating fires proved the horrifying truth. After disasters like Kelsey Castle, even the proudest nobles finally surrendered. They banished the kitchens far outside the main keep, choosing cold meals over the risk of burning alive in their sleep. Yet the danger never disappeared. Inside that exiled kitchen waited a monster that never slept, and it demanded a terrible human price. In this video, we step into the warmest and deadliest room in the castle. We'll discover why medieval kitchens were far more dangerous than most history books admit. The brutal daily reality cooks and servants faced, the shocking class divide happening right beside the flames, and the forgotten men, women and children who kept the entire medieval world alive. By the end, you'll understand that every bite of food and every moment of warmth in the Middle Ages came with a hidden, deadly cost, and you'll never take modern safety for granted again. Stay until the final minutes. The real price these unsung workers paid might actually hit harder than you expect. If you're ready for more dark and fascinating corners of medieval history, do me a favour, smash that like button and subscribe right now. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next deadly chapter. Your support keeps these stories alive. Picture this. It's the dead of night in a great stone castle. The wind howls through arrow slits. Inside the Lord's plush master bedrooms, everyone sleeps soundly under heavy furs. Then, a single spark leaps from an open hearth. Within minutes, flames race across wooden floors, devour tapestries, and gut the timber insides of the entire keep. What no enemy army could achieve with battering rams and siege towers, one careless flame could accomplish in hours, turning a mighty stone fortress into a giant roaring chimney. This was the ever-present terror that haunted every medieval lord. Fire wasn't just a tool for cooking. It was a sleeping dragon living right in the heart of the home, and for centuries that dragon slept far too close for comfort. In the early Middle Ages, kitchens were often placed right next to the Great Hall, or even inside the main keep. Convenience ruled above all. The lord wanted his roasted meats and spiced wines delivered piping hot. Servants wanted to avoid freezing while carrying heavy trays through icy courtyards. But that convenience came with catastrophic risk. One stray ember, one overturned oil lamp, one sudden gust of wind feeding the flames, and the castle's greatest enemy wasn't outside the walls, it was already inside. History delivers the brutal receipts. At Kelsey Castle in northern France, one of the most formidable fortresses of the 13th century with its colossal cylindrical keep, repeated fires exposed the lethal flaw. The combination of open hearths, massive timber framing, and mountains of stored firewood turned the kitchen area into a powder keg waiting for a match. Similar disasters forced painful redesigns at other strongholds. At Bodiam Castle in Sussex, England, the layout changed dramatically. Lords and master builders finally pushed the kitchens away from the luxurious heart of the castle, isolating them to protect the living quarters. The solutions were practical but telling. Many castles moved kitchens into completely separate buildings in the outer bailey. Others placed them in isolated ground floor wings connected only by long covered walkways. These passages allowed servants to move food without exposing the main keep to constant danger. Thick stone walls, fewer wooden elements, and strategic distance became the new defensive standard. The dry truth? Medieval architects basically looked at these beautiful, perfectly located kitchens and said, "Wonderful design. Now put it in another zip code." It was a painful trade-off. Nobles who once demanded hot food at a moment's notice now accepted cold meals rather than risk burning to death in their sleep. Better a lukewarm pie than watching your entire legacy go up in smoke from your own kitchen. Yet even when banished to the edges of the castle, the danger didn't vanish. It simply changed shape. Because inside those exiled kitchens waited something even more formidable. A monster that never slept. And that monster is exactly where we're going next. Stepping into the banished kitchen after the chill of the Outer Bailey, the change hits you instantly. The air shifts from freezing damp to a heavy searing wall of heat. Dominating the room stands the great hearth, a massive stone and iron construction, large enough for a grown man to stand inside. Wide and deep enough, in fact, to roast an entire ox on a single iron spit. This wasn't a fire you kindled each morning and let die at dusk. It burned 24 hours a day, every day of the year. The constant roar of flames and crackle of splitting logs created a relentless soundtrack that never faded. Orange light flickered across walls blackened with layers of soot, while smoke hung thick in the rafters. Feeding this operation demanded serious logistics. Castle records and archaeological finds show that a large household could burn through 1 to 2 tons of seasoned hardwood every day. Oak, beech, and ash, carefully stacked and rotated. Teams of servants worked in rotating shifts just to keep the supply coming. If the fire died down too far, the immediate crisis wasn't starvation. It was the complete breakdown of daily life. No hot food for the Lord's table, no bread baked, no water boiled, and no way to prepare the preserved meats and salted stores that kept the castle running. In an era before refrigeration, consistent heat was the difference between order and chaos. This wasn't simple cooking. It was operating a dangerous high-maintenance medieval power plant, one that provided essential heat and light, but could turn against its operators in seconds. Picture the scene at 3 a.m. The head cook wipes sweat from his brow while directing 2 young boys straining at the massive spit. Their small bodies lean into the iron crank, turning it hour after hour so the ox roasts evenly. Fat drips and flares up with sharp hisses. Sparks shower outward whenever a log shifts. The boys' faces glow red in the firelight, their arms burning with fatigue. Meanwhile, the cook dodges radiant heat that could blister skin from several feet away, all while trying to coordinate multiple cauldrons bubbling over side fires. As one historian dryly noted, medieval kitchens ran on a simple principle: the fire must never sleep, even if the people tending it desperately wanted to. The great hearth was both the castle's lifeline and its greatest hidden vulnerability. It gave warmth and sustenance to everyone from the lord down to the lowest servant, yet it demanded absolute vigilance, endless fuel, and total physical sacrifice. One neglected log, one distracted moment, and the same flames that roasted dinner could claim far more than supper. Running this monster demanded a terrible human cost, and that human cost is exactly what we'll confront next. The great hearth kept roaring, but now let's move closer, right into the space where the real work happened. This is where the human body met medieval fire head-on, and the body almost always lost. Picture a typical kitchen shift in the height of summer or the depth of winter. It barely mattered. The temperature around the hearth regularly climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes higher near the flames. Young boys, often aged 10 to 14, stood for 10 to 14 hours a day turning the heavy iron spits. These spits weren't light skewers. Some weighed over 50 pounds with a full ox or several pigs impaled on them. The boys leaned their entire small frames into the crank, arms trembling, backs aching, skin reddening from the constant radiant heat. Nearby, other servants hauled massive bronze or iron cauldrons filled with boiling water, stew, or oil. One slip, one loose grip, and hundreds of pounds of scalding liquid could crash down. The air itself felt thick, heavy with the smell of roasting meat, wood smoke, and human sweat. This wasn't cooking. This was medieval heavy industry, with complementary third-degree burns. The medical horrors were relentless. Radiant heat from the open flames could cause temporary or even permanent blindness, a condition similar to what glassmakers and blacksmiths suffered, where the intense infrared light damaged the eyes over time. Sudden bursts of flame when dripping fat hit the coals turned into miniature explosions, sending burning grease flying like napalm across arms, faces, and chests. Severe burns were so common that many cooks bore lifelong scars. Chronic heat exhaustion drained their strength, caused dizziness, fainting, and in extreme cases, organ failure. You can almost hear it. The constant hiss and pop of fat hitting fire, the groan of boys straining at the spit, the sharp cry when someone got splashed, followed by hurried attempts to douse the wound with whatever water was nearby. There were no modern burn units, no antibiotics, no painkillers stronger than willow bark or opium, if you were lucky. An infected burn often meant a slow, agonising death. Archaeological evidence and surviving hospital records from the period show kitchen workers suffered disproportionately from skeletal stress injuries, eye problems and scar tissue. Their bodies carried the invisible ledger of every meal served in the Great Hall above. Yet these workers kept going. They had to. The Lord and his guests expected perfectly roasted meats, hot soups, and fresh bread regardless of the human cost downstairs. The kitchen operated like a brutal assembly line where the machines were living children and exhausted adults, and the fuel was their own endurance. The fire didn't just burn the food, it was slowly destroying the people who fed it, and the most silent, invisible destroyer was still waiting in the air they breathed. That's where the story gets even darker. Even with the great hearth roaring and the spits turning, the most dangerous threat in the kitchen wasn't the flames you could see. It was the enemy you couldn't escape. The thick, toxic smoke that filled the room hour after hour, day after day. Step inside and the first thing that hits you is the haze. Smoke hung in heavy layers, stinging the eyes and burning the throat with every breath. Primitive ventilation, little more than high windows or simple roof vents, did almost nothing against the constant output of an open hearth burning tons of wood. The walls, once pale stone, turned pitch black with layers of greasy soot that was not only filthy but highly flammable. One good spark hitting those walls could trigger a flash fire in seconds. Workers tried everything they could. Many tied wet rags over their mouths and noses, hoping the moisture would filter out some of the worst particles. The rags didn't save their lungs. They just kept them alive long enough to finish the shift. Modern forensic archaeology has uncovered the true scale of the damage. Studies of medieval skeletons from kitchen staff and servants buried near castles and monasteries reveal heavy carbon deposits inside the rib cages and facial sinuses, indications of lung damage so extensive that researchers compare it to the effects of smoking, roughly 40 cigarettes a day for decades. These weren't battle scars. These were the quiet, cumulative marks of an entire working life spent breathing wood smoke, soot, and toxic vapours. You can almost feel it with them. Eyes watering constantly, vision blurred by irritation, chest tight with deep, racking coughs that never fully went away. At the end of a long shift, workers would stagger into the courtyard, gasping for fresher air, only to return hours later for the next round. Many slept in lofts or rooms directly above the kitchen, breathing the same poisoned atmosphere even at night. High ceilings, which we often admire today as elegant medieval architecture, were in many cases a desperate survival measure. Builders raised the roofs higher simply to give the smoke somewhere to rise and linger above head level, granting workers a few more years of marginally breathable air. It wasn't about grandeur, it was damage control. This invisible killer operated in silence. While dramatic burns and accidents took lives quickly and visibly, smoke delivered a slower, more democratic death. It didn't care whether you were the master cook or the youngest turnspit boy. Over years, it weakened lungs, strained hearts, and left entire kitchen staffs with chronic respiratory conditions that no medieval healer could properly treat. Yet this deadly environment, choking smoke, blistering heat, and constant danger, still had to feed two very different worlds. Because in the same smoky, soot-stained space, two completely separate menus were being prepared side by side. One for the nobles upstairs, and one for the people doing the actual work, and that's where the class divide becomes impossible to ignore. In the same choking, smoke-filled kitchen we just left, something almost surreal was happening every single day. Right next to each other, two completely different worlds were being fed from the same dangerous hearth. On one side of the long wooden tables, servants prepared the Lord's feast. A whole peacock plucked and roasted to a golden shine, then carefully redressed in its own brilliant feathers so it looked alive on the platter. It was spiced heavily with expensive imports: saffron, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and grains of paradise. These spices cost a small fortune and were worth more than their weight in gold. Yet despite what modern myths suggest, those expensive spices weren't used to mask rotten meat. The Lord was rich enough to eat fresh. Instead, it was pure, unadulterated medieval flexing. It was culinary propaganda, designed to prove you could afford to literally eat money. Just a few feet away, in the same soot-blackened space, cooks prepared the servants' meal: simple pottage. A thick stew of barley, dried peas, whatever vegetables were in season, and occasionally scraps of meat or bones the nobles hadn't claimed. It bubbled in a smaller cauldron over the edge of the same great hearth. No spices, no ceremony, just basic sustenance to keep the kitchen staff on their feet for another long shift. You could literally see the class divide on the same cutting boards. The finest white manchet bread for the high table versus coarse dark rye or barley loaves for everyone else. Your bread told everyone exactly where you stood, and how likely you were to die young. The contrast was stark and constant. While one team carefully basted the peacock with rosewater and honey, another stirred the humble pottage with the same wooden spoon that might have just scraped ashes from the hearth. All of this happened in the same toxic air thick with smoke and grease, where one wrong splash of boiling fat or one sudden flare-up could injure the cook preparing the Lord's delicacy just as easily as the one making dinner for the staff. This wasn't just about food, it was about power made visible on every plate. The nobles upstairs enjoyed the illusion of luxury and refinement, rarely seeing, or choosing not to see, the human cost and health risks happening downstairs in the very same room. Meanwhile, the kitchen workers inhaled the same carcinogenic smoke, dodged the same flying grease, and suffered the same burns whether they were roasting a priceless spiced bird or boiling a pot of peas. Historians point out that this system was remarkably efficient in its inequality. The kitchen became a perfect microcosm of medieval society. Extreme hierarchy operating under extreme danger. Everyone ate, but only some ate well, and everyone paid the price in health. Keeping this system running brought even more dangers, because feeding both worlds required constant water, heavy tools, slippery floors, and razor-sharp blades, all inside an environment already trying to kill you. And that's where the everyday accidents turn truly nightmarish. Feeding two entirely different worlds in that same smoky kitchen required one resource more than almost anything else: water. And getting it was a war in itself. Servants, often the youngest boys or lowest-ranking kitchen staff, made endless trips to the castle well or cistern, hauling heavy wooden buckets and yokes loaded with dozens of gallons. Stone floors that were already slick with grease, spilled fat, and ashes became treacherous skating rinks every time water sloshed over the sides. They carried it constantly, for boiling, for washing, for mixing dough, for cleaning the giant cauldrons. There was never enough, and the water itself was rarely clean. It came from wells that could be contaminated by runoff from the latrines or animal pens. Yet it still had to be boiled repeatedly just to make it somewhat safer. Around them loomed the dangerous tools of the trade, giant cleavers sharp enough to hack through bone, red-hot iron cauldrons swinging on chains over the fire, long spits heavy enough to impale an entire deer. One wrong swing, one frayed rope, one tired arm, and catastrophe was instant. Now imagine the worst moment. A young kitchen boy, arms burning from hours of hauling water, slips on a patch of grease-slick stone. The massive cauldron he's helping carry tips. Boiling liquid, water, oil, or stew cascades over his body. The scream cuts through the roar of the hearth. His skin blisters instantly. In a world with no antibiotics and no understanding of bacteria, even a moderate burn often led to a raging infection. And the medieval medical treatment? Coating the raw skin in animal grease or unsterilised herbs, practically guaranteeing sepsis. Many victims lingered for days or weeks in agony before succumbing to fever and blood poisoning. These weren't rare tragedies. They were occupational hazards that everyone in the kitchen lived with every single day. Hygiene nightmares made everything worse. Waste from gutting animals, vegetable scraps, and dirty water mixed on the floors. Cross-contamination was constant. The the same surfaces used for raw meat, cooked food, and washing. Rats and flies feasted openly. The smell could be overwhelming. Medieval food safety rule: if it doesn't smell like death yet, serve it. This combination of slippery floors, scalding liquids, razor-sharp tools, and poor sanitation turned the kitchen into a high-risk industrial accident zone centuries before the term even existed. A single moment of exhaustion or bad luck could end a life that had already been shortened by smoke and burns. Yet even in this dangerous hell, the kitchen offered something people desperately needed. In the freezing stone castle, where every other room felt like a tomb of damp cold, the kitchen was the only source of genuine warmth, a flawed sanctuary that drew servants and even off-duty soldiers like moths to the flame, and that warmth came with its own hidden price. Even after the day's chaos, the slips, the scalds, the endless smoke, the kitchen never truly emptied. As night fell and the rest of the castle grew bitterly cold, this dangerous room became something else entirely, the only real source of warmth in a sea of freezing stone. Outside the kitchen walls, the great hall and bedchambers turned icy. Damp wind whistled through arrow slits, and temperatures inside the keep often dropped near freezing. But around the great hearth, the air remained thick and warm, almost alive with heat. Off-duty men-at-arms coming in from the battlements, exhausted senior servants, stewards and huntsmen would drift toward the glowing fire like moths to a flame. They huddled on low benches or sat directly on the warm stone floor, cloaks pulled tight, hands stretched toward the flames. For a few precious hours, the kitchen became a flawed sanctuary. You could hear quiet conversations, tired laughter, and the occasional dark joke about whose turn it was to get burned next. Someone might pass around a jug of weak ale or a shared bowl of leftover pottage. In those moments, the strict hierarchy of the castle softened just a little. A senior guard might sit near a turnspit boy, both silently grateful for the same heat. But the danger never left. Smoke still curled around their faces. Sparks occasionally leapt out and landed on clothing. The same grease-slick floor that had claimed victims earlier in the day remained treacherous in the dim firelight. Every laugh carried an edge, because everyone knew the price of this warmth. This was no cozy fireside scene from a storybook. It was exhausted humanity grabbing whatever comfort it could in a world that offered almost none. The same fire that roasted their food and warmed their bones was also slowly destroying them, scarring lungs, blistering skin, and shortening lives. Hierarchy might have softened slightly around the hearth, but the cost was still paid in burned flesh, chronic coughs, and eyes that would never quite stop stinging. The kitchen gave the castle life. It was the one place where cold, hungry, overworked people could feel momentarily human. Yet that humanity came at a terrible daily price. And in the end, that price is what defined the entire medieval kitchen, the most vital and the deadliest room in the castle. In our final part, we'll look at the real human cost these forgotten workers paid, and why their silent contribution kept the whole medieval world from freezing and starving. We've walked through the smoke, felt the blistering heat, heard the screams of the burned, and witnessed the quiet endurance of those who kept the hearth alive. Now it's time to step back and see the full picture. The medieval kitchen was the ultimate paradox, the most vital room in the entire castle, and the deadliest. It gave life through warmth and food in a world that was otherwise freezing and hungry. It powered the social hierarchy, fed the feasts that displayed power, and offered the only real comfort in a stone fortress that felt more like a tomb than a home. Yet it slowly killed the very people who made it function. One stray spark, one slippery step, one lifetime of breathing poisoned smoke, and the cost was paid in scarred bodies and shortened lives. The nobility got the glory and the spiced peacock. Cooks and servants got scorched lungs, burned skin, and early graves. Yet without them, the entire castle would have frozen and starved. These were not famous names in history books. They left no chronicles, no statues, no coats of arms, just blackened rib cages in forgotten graves, calloused hands that never fully healed, and generations of invisible labour that kept medieval society running. They fought a daily battle against a monster hearth that never slept, in a room that was both sanctuary and execution chamber. History has always celebrated the swords, the sieges, and the lords. But the real story of survival was written in sweat, burns, and quiet endurance by the people working in the deadliest room of all. So the next time you stand in your modern kitchen, safe, clean, with running water, electric lights, and no risk of roasting an ox at 3 a.m, remember those who came before, the ones who turned the spits, hauled the water, breathed the smoke, and somehow kept the fire alive. Their sacrifice wasn't glorious, but it was essential. If you want to uncover more deadly and forgotten corners of medieval life, brutal medicine, siege survival, hygiene horrors, and the hidden truths behind the legends, let me know in the comments. I'm Medieval Oddities, and I'll see you in the next dangerous chapter of history. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, and stay safe in your own kitchen.